Hello, welcome to Pandooradom. I am your host, Miles Gray. Nice to see you all again, fellow Pandoranauts, and welcome to the show. We do have a few important interviews lined up in the coming weeks, so we'll get to those with joy. I just wanted to talk a little bit as sort of a preamble to some of that material about some of my personal progress, if that's of any interest, which it may be to some. Uh, you know, Pandoradom is not just about uncovering the biggest mysteries, but also about uncovering the smallest mysteries. That is to say that while it's absolutely fascinating to learn the secrets of the ancient deeps or shipwrecks lost to time, unusual mechanisms buried in the sand, cold cases suddenly solved. It's also about uncovering the mysteries in your fellow man or woman or any other for that matter. It's about understanding that there is a vast mystery to all things, down to the smallest consideration, even just friendships, acquaintanceships, someone that you run into on the street whom you don't even know, or that you do. Uh, just in talking, just in interacting, even if you are a totally, mostly an introverted person, even the slightest word exchanged uncovers mysteries in the other. This relates, of course, to Martin Buber with Ich und Du and these sorts of ways of looking at subjectivity and objectivity. Um, Also what is that? Guattari or Guattari? I don't remember how to pronounce his name, but and the fellow he worked with, I think it starts with a D. What is It's been years since I read that book, but that also plays a role here. Um, so you can uncover these mysteries, what you might call colloquial mysteries, everyday mysteries. And it's something that you don't necessarily think of it as something mysterious or something, that's a mystery. Honestly, it seems very everyday, and I would say to many people who are even the least bit misanthropic or just don't have the time or the patience for humanity anymore, at least on certain days, uh, even for someone like that, there is a mystery to behold and a possible deconcealment to further behold. Although I do remember when I was working in China in 2010 in Shenyang, I do I was involved with this young woman kind of, um, yeah, and I remember she told me that among us it's commonly said, which I am not sure what us means here. It could mean family, it could mean a wider demographic. But anyway, she said that it's taken as a rule by us often that to explain is to conceal. Because I was trying to explain to her my feelings, of course. Yeah, well, that's I would that would mean a very particular thing if somebody said that to you while you were trying to explain your feelings in the United States. I mean, that would be if someone said to explain is to conceal, it's kind of like, don't tell me, I don't want to know. That brings to mind that No Doubt song. Um, but in this particular case, I understood that the feeling was essentially mutual. So it actually had a totally different meaning and context in China. So that was an interesting development in my earlier life, we'll say. I mean, I've had many different lives. They all sort of float, sort of shift one into the other, not seamlessly perhaps, but with less with less conflicting sort of drag than you might expect. In a way, it's almost what is that called? Mandela effect, like, you just sort of seamlessly transition without even realizing it from one reality into a sort of splitting or uh, what is the word here? See, I have all these different languages running through my head, and I'm always trying to remember which language I'm speaking in terms of which vocabulary word to choose. Converging. That's the word I need. That's the English word that I needed from the morass of different language options for that word that are running like horses in a horse race through my head at the moment. Yeah, that's very problematic, but you learn to speak as best you can. And you might ask, would it have been better to stay monolingual? I don't think so. I think that ultimately the boons of being multilingual outweigh some of the eases of being monolingual. Um, so I think it's appropriate. I think that the choice is justified. Anyway, so what did I want to say personally? Getting to the actual personal bit here. So I actually finished an important research paper that I've been working on for the entire semester. Of course, I'm going back to school. I used to go to VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. That was from 2004 to 2008. And for difficult reasons, I was unable to get my actual diploma, although I was there for quite a number of years. It was ultimately financial, I would say. And then I didn't go to school. I didn't seek higher education other than community college in Northern Virginia for quite some time. And I was mostly an autodidact for all these years, publishing books and poems and working abroad. Um, and I would say, in some ways, if I can be immodest enough to say so, I may have gotten a much better education as an autodidact than I ever would have in, an institution of higher learning of an actual, we'll say, uh, here I go again with the horse race of foreign words in parallel. What is the word? Accredited. So from an accredited institution of higher learning. I mean, that is to say, I think of being an autodidact as being an institution of higher learning if you make it so. You yourself as a being are an institution, and you can make it one of higher learning. Of course, I mean this in a somewhat facetious metaphorical sense, but in a poetic sense, it's very true. As they say, your body is a temple. Why not be an institution of higher learning while you're at it? But of course, I mean an actual institution of higher learning, a physical university that, exists with the concomitant ideal of being a place of higher learning in the academic sense, which, you can't, uh, you know, which you can't forfeit with just papers and all the sort of physical documents of the buildings. That is to say, you can't just make a university with the rooms and the roofs and the chairs and the desks and not actually have any content to be taught. Would it really be a university? No students, no lectures, emptiness, quiet in the halls. Yeah, there's, that's an apocalyptic nightmare. Anyway, what I'm saying though is that that's where I went at VCU. I wasn't able to finish, continued as an autodidact. There's great danger in being an autodidact as well, of course, because one of the greatest uh, positive aspects of being in an actual university, in my estimation, as opposed to being an autodidact, is that you come upon a particular viewpoint, even a whole Weltanschauung or way of looking at the world, worldview, and it's pretty much something that you somehow organically created within yourself from a general amalgam of things that you have perceived from various sources rather idiosyncratically. So newspaper articles you've read, magazine columns that you have perused, perhaps studies that you've read through, TV programs, the news, radio, conversations you've had with friends and relatives, acquaintances and colleagues, and so forth. And that's how you sort of create opinions. That's how you come to have your own opinions about anything in the world. It's not just by influence, it's also sort of bringing all those sources together in your mind, and they sort of organically uh, come together and create an opinion or a view and eventually a whole worldview. Uh, Together with your own mullings and critical thought or lack thereof concerning all of this information that you brought in. So it's sort of information plus imagination. It creates opinions and viewpoint and worldview. But as an autodidact, even the most amazing and incredible autodidact, it's still an echo chamber of one. And being in a university, for all of its faults, at least, theoretically, should expose you to many more people, and it will be an echo chamber of many at, at least. Uh, okay, just a moment. Okay, so, well, so that would be probably one of the great things about being in an actual university. Anyway, so I did come back to university. I'm now in the Levant in the Middle East, and I am in a university here, or a college rather, continuing my education uh, non-autodidactically. Well, I continue autodidactically, but it's both autodidactically and also with an actual academic institution of higher learning outside of myself. And so I finally finished this research paper. It's about 30 pages, so it's not huge, but bigger than I had expected. And it's qualitative linguistics research. And it came out quite well. I submitted it. My professor said she thinks it's publishable. It was meant as just uh, a semester end, uh, research paper for a class, but she said that it's publishable within the field, so I should submit it for review. So that was unexpected. I mean, I hope that would be possible, that it might actually make some kind of actual academic contribution. So that's the very thing. I would say the grand majority of the insights that allowed me to construct this linguistics research paper as I did, to get it to that point of being publishable, that was all from autodidacticity. All of it really was mostly learned from what I learned by myself. It's not that I learned it from within myself. Obviously, I had to have access to academic to scholarly articles, whether in physical libraries, or otherwise. Of course, I've spent much of my adult life abroad in places where even if there was a library nearby, most of the books would have been in a foreign language, some of which I would have understood, at least to some degree. Whether I could read academic articles in those languages is another question. Some I could, but I spent many years in China. I can read Chinese to a degree. I don't know if I would be able to really read and understand scientific articles in Mandarin. I mean, maybe a little bit, but I don't think, I mean, a lot of the technical terms in science I probably would not know unless I really, you'd have to learn, scientific Chinese basically. Uh, I can understand, I can write and read at a academic level, Hebrew language, scientific language. What else? I can read Arabic uh, to a certain degree. I think my literary Arabic is okay. I don't know if I would be able to understand all scientific literature in Arabic. Uh, Probably not, but at least maybe some. Uh, and of course, romance languages, I can basically get the gist. So, uh, Spanish and Portuguese for sure. Probably, some of Romanian, Catalan, pretty a lot of it, yeah. But I mean, they're all so close from a romance perspective. I mean, if you know Latin, then it's really not that difficult to be able to get the gist of the majority of even, especially higher language articles in those tongues, because of course, as a general rule, the higher register a piece of literature is, the more it's likely to have in common with its sort of informing language. That is to say that if you're speaking Urdu or Hindi, um, if they're being spoken in their simple, colloquial, lower level register, they'll be somewhat differentiated. That's to say that Hindi will be more influenced by Indian subcontinental words and or sorry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. This is the opposite in this case. My apologies. With Hindi and Urdu, in their simpler registers, they're all basically almost identical. That's sorry that I mixed it up. Okay, so they're almost identical. Basically having what you might call a Hindi substrate, or a Hindustani substrate, but it's very complicated. There's so many historical dialects that inform modern Hindi. It's a complicated thing. But once they get into their higher registers, when it's poetic or literary Hindi, it resembles Sanskrit, which is its informing language. And then Urdu, in its higher registers, resembles more Persian, with some Arabic loans. Uh, and that's a very curious phenomenon. Uh, so when you're dealing with romance languages, I would say that for very basic words like house and a tree, in the very simple register, many of these languages are going to have words that are very, very similar, and you'll probably be able to tell that they're the same word. But then there's sort of something like in the middle, not as simple as tree or house, a little bit more complicated. but still basic language, then they're more likely to be differentiated on this sort of intermediate level. But then when you get up to higher level speech and literature, so much of it is informed by direct Latin borrowings, or not borrowings, cognates, uh, or that is to say that all of these Romance tongues for their higher register vocabulary will be cognates with each other from Latin, and in some cases Greek, though they descend from Latin, and then the Greek is borrowings, often via Latin. So, and then in this case, with the higher level vocabulary, they're extremely likely to be, we'll say, interlegible. So pretty much if you're reading a scientific paper in Romanian, Spanish, Portuguese, and you know Latin or any one of those Romance languages, you're likely to be able to at least generally have a sense of what you're reading, uh, regardless of what language you are reading from. But enough of that sort of linguistic discussion. We'll touch on linguistics from time to time. It's sort of an interest of mine. Uh, well, not just really a hobby. I mean, it's something that I studied uh, both in the real university and in my internal university for many, many, many years. Comparative linguistics, basically. But this is a really important distinction for me, that it's not that I'm a linguistics buff. It's in fact that while I kind of am drawn to linguistics, it's not even necessarily that I totally supremely like it. It's more of what I would call a utilitarian interest in linguistics, because first and foremost, I would say that I am a writer, a poet, a novelist. The poetry, the novelry kind of um, merge in much of the writing I do. I mean, it's some people call it novels in verse. It's not rhymed verse for the most part. I mean, it's like what you might call free verse. Um, that is, it's prose in many cases. I mean, I actually have I published a book of actual poetry in the more recognizable sense, but a lot of what I'm working on now, they're what are sometimes called long poems in English, and in Hebrew they're called poemot. Um, Many languages it's called a poema, so it's like a poem, but it means specifically a long poem. And in English, when you say long poem, it doesn't just mean a poem that's long. It's a technical term. And a long poem, it is kind of nebulous, but the general gist of it is it's pretty much a very long poem that does not fit into the general epic genre. So you have an epic, which is generally supremely long. You have its smaller son, a tiny epic like epic, which is called an epyllion. And then you have long poems, which are not really epic in style, according to the traditional definition or conceptualization of what an epic is or should be, but nonetheless, it is epic in length. So that's a long poem. So an example of a traditional epic would be, say, well, obviously the Iliad or the Odyssey. And there are many others, of course. I mean, you have the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, you have the Epic of Gilgamesh, the what is that Tibetan? I can't think of that one. There's so many. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head on the spot here. The thing is, if I weren't on video, I think I'd be able to better recall them. I'm still practicing being able to recall on video, or it's not live, but I think of it as live. Uh, to recall live when you're on the spot is a bit more difficult than when you're not on the spot. But that's the nature of acting or being on camera, I would say that you have to learn to be able to, think on your feet. So, those are some examples of more traditional epics. But then there are less traditional but epics, and I would still personally say that they are kind of epics. I would say that I believe Michael Lind. He this see, there's a guy named Michael Lind who wrote an epic, a modern epic in English about the Alamo, which you may know is an important battle in early America. Well, not exactly early America, but somewhere in the middle between modern and early America. And it was a last stand sort of situation. So Michael Lind was widely considered by the critics of the time. I don't remember when this was exactly, the 1990s or 80s. I could be totally off, but I think it was something like that when he published this book. I did have a copy when I was still in America, but I don't know. Unfortunately, that's somewhere. I don't know if it's still with a relative or if I don't know. I should know. I wish I still had that book. Anyway, the critics of the time were pretty brutal. They basically said that Lind was one of the worst poetasters. That's a terrible poet, a poetic disaster, a disastrous poet, a poetaster, uh, and that it was ill conceived, ill rhymed, and was just the worst poetry ever written. Now, of course, I don't really agree. I would say I have a very high tolerance for even what is often considered to be what I call lo-fi poetry. So even Michael Lind, I rather enjoyed, but I would say that that was regardless of whether you like it or think it's terrible, I would still say it qualifies in style as something like a smaller epic in style, or at least in how it was conceived and meant by Lind. And I'm trying to think of another modern example that I would say is sort of an actual epic. Hmm. In that sense, with here with a hero and a particular type of story arc. That is a hard thing to say. I hmm, it's very difficult because when you start getting into modern epics, they tend to get very well modern or postmodern, and the sort of traditional models of story arc and hero, uh, they start to break down. So I mean, what I'm thinking of actually is the book In Parenthesis, which is basically a treatment of World War I experiences. It sort of follows a soldier, but I don't think you even know his name. I believe it's essential, sort of autobiographical. Um, Amazing, very postmodern though. I mean, it's the kind of, or I don't know, it's not post. I'd say it's modern, not postmodern, but it's very inventive poetry. It's very inventive. It's lyrical and yet kind of I call it even staccato. It just kind of is clipped and strange turns of phrase. You have a lot of colloquialisms, period colloquialisms that are interspersed that seem alien to a modern, say, American reader, but they would have been more familiar to a British soldier of that era. But a lot of it is inventive, innovative patterns of speech or written lyricism that wouldn't be recognizable to anybody. And that's what it really means to be a poet of this kind, to be very inventive, but still readable. Well, not always. Some are not readable, but I still say they're poets. Readability or legibility is a relative thing. Uh, so it's definitely not an epic in the traditional sense, but yet it springs to mind as a kind of modern epic. I would not, if I were really pressed, I mean, come on, Miles, do you think that In Parenthesis is a traditional epic of the modern age? No, if I'm up against the wall, then no. Even though associatively I see it as being a descendant kind of that tradition, I would say ultimately, In Parenthesis, is a long poem. Uh, I would say that Wordsworth's Prelude is also a long poem in this sense. It's, you know, some people call it a personal epic. I mean, if you wanted to say that, I would say that's possible. It's a romantic personal epic, an epic of the self. Similarly, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and specifically the sub long poem Song of Myself, that's also an epic of the self, a personal epic, but is ultimately a long poem. Aurora Lee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I would say that's a complicated. I'd say it's a novel in verse. Um, and then you have Anne Carson, a more modern poetess or novelist, somewhere in the middle, because I would say hers are basically novels in verse as well. And then you take a guy like um, what is it, Amos Tutuola, and you know he has the one of my favorites, the palm wine drinkard, not drunkard, but drinkard, and this is a whole story as to why it's drinkard and not drunkard. So anyway, the palm wine drinkard by Tutuola is a very curious book. It read in isolation, if you don't know the history of modern Nigerian literature, it seems totally bizarre. If you know a little bit more about the background from which he was writing, and also something about traditional Nigerian folklore, then it will be less bizarre as an initial reader. So he's definitely highly informed by traditional Nigerian folklore and also some of the more modern fellow Nigerian poets of the era that directly preceded him. And nonetheless, he is totally something of his own, something all his own. Anyway, but Tutuola in The Palm Wine Drinker, it's essentially a novel, but it's written in such an idiosyncratic way that I would call it kind of by default lyrical poetry in prose. So I don't think it was meant that way necessarily. I think it was meant as a novel, but it reads in some ways the way that modern prose like poems or long poems are written. I mean, you know, some of it is much more contrived. I don't know. It's very, I would, his is somewhat contrived as well, I would say. But that's a source of argument. But whether he was really writing that way in a more organic sense, like that was really how he wrote, or if it was sort of his own register that was kind of made up, which I think is mostly agreed that it's the latter. But then you take people like Frank Stanford with where the moon says I no, it's the battlefield where the moon says I love you, which is essentially a single run-on sentence to my memory that there's not even any punctuation throughout the entire book. And I actually have it here with me in the Levant on my bookshelf. It's about this thick. This is long, I don't think I could say this word, a long poem. You know, this is a big poem. Um, so it is definitely a long poem, not an epic, I wouldn't say in the traditional sense. So maybe this gives you something of an idea of the difference between a traditional epic, both the ancient and modern forms, and the separate category but related category, the long poem. And as I said, which is basically parallel to the so-called poema in Hebrew and some other languages. So, of course, in Hebrew, you also have these sort of long poems as well. I mean, one of the big ones is Masada, or um, by why can I think of his name? Um, Give me a second. Yitzhak Lamdan. So he wrote this very interesting piece. Of course, it is largely concerned with the Jewish people and their suffering throughout history. It's a very particular genre. This he wrote it in the 20s, I believe, so it was already a very different era. Um, sort of unaffected by later developments that century. Um, so it's very interesting from that standpoint because it's very different from something that was written, a long poem that was written during the Holocaust, 20 something years later, or well, 20 years later, depending on when in the 1920s he wrote it. But so you get into the actual Holocaust, and then you have Katznelson, who wrote another long poem, which was in Yiddish this time, not Hebrew. Um, and that's a whole other question of, why some Jewish authors wrote in Hebrew and why others wrote in Yiddish. And sometimes some wrote in both, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, he wrote in the English translation would be um, the song of the murdered Jewish people. Now he wrote this from within a camp, to my recollection. Um, and he later, he wrote it when a lot of his family had already been murdered, and it was only he and his son that remained. And then both of them, I believe, later died in Auschwitz, if I'm not mistaken. So that is Katznelson. There's a whole story as to how his that particular poem survived the war or the Holocaust. Um, which I'll get to another time, hopefully. And that brings to mind another poet of the Holocaust. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. This is Hungarian, which I'm not. Radnoti. So, any Hungarian listeners, I apologize if I'm butchering his name. But you can correct me in the comments if there will ever be a Hungarian fan, a Hungarian Pandora not. Salutes to you. So anyway, Radnoti, he wrote um, poems. They were in his pocket on the death march, to my memory. I mean, this is unbelievable stuff. His were shorter poems, these were shorter lyrical poems, uh, based on what was happening in his experience of Hashoah, or the Holocaust. So that's Radnoti. Another Holocaust poet is Chelan or Celan. He mostly was doing shorter poems, had a huge influence on me as a writer, expressionistically, I would say, and also in his use of um, neologistic compounds. In German, that's a normal procedure for coining new words. So I think in German, it's already, which was his language, his original language, his native tongue. I mean, he so in a way, there's an intuitive uh, ease as a German speaker to coin new words, even neologisms, via compounding. English, we do a fair amount of compounding as well, but it follows sort of a different manner than the German to a certain degree. Part of it, of course, is just that in German, when you write it, it looks like a single run-on word. And then when you write it in English, in many cases, even though it's a compound word, there will be spaces between the words of the compound. So if I say something like um, uh, I'm trying to think of a possible compound. Let's see. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank. Um, because all of the things I'm thinking of are have adjectives, and I'm trying to think of something that only has nouns. Um, I'm really totally drawing a blank. This is very unprofessional. So much for thinking on my feet. But you know, you could say something like oh, that's also an adjective. Oh, what am I gonna do here? It's sometimes a little bit nebulous because if I say um hmm, ooh, this is uh hmm, yeah, it's all yeah, I'm terribly sorry because everything I can think of has adjectives in it. Um, and it's yeah. I mean, I guess you could say oh, I'm my apologies, of course. I'm trying to think of a long compound, but I really am not able to think of anything off the top of my head. Uh, because I mean, if I say something like oh, central command center, the problem is that the word central is an adjective. Command and center, that's two nouns. So if I just say command center, that's a compound. Now in English, those are two separate words. There's going to be a space in this case. Once in a while, it's possible someone might insert a hyphen between command and center, but that would probably look rather that would probably seem strange. Um, if I took away the central, rid ourselves of the adjective, and you say command center, could you add some kind of noun? You could say command center general. So that's already a situation where it's a compound, all of an all noun compound. The problem is because of the nature of the English language and its sort of distributive aspect, if you say command center general, even though it's an all noun compound, technically command center modifies general in an adjective, a quasi adjective, a quasi adjectival manner, and it's actually comparable in some ways to the way that compounding occurs in East Asian languages, um, where sometimes parts of speech, noun, adjective, etc., because the word is completely the same with no alterations for case or tense or anything. Um, it's not clear if they separated into different parts of speech or what part of speech they are. Noun, adjective, etc., is very ambiguous if it even applies, if those categories even apply at all. So that's really the thing. I mean, when it comes to Hebrew, for example, a lot of those cases, you would actually use uh, a technically adjectival form in that case. So um, it depends. Sometimes you'll have a full out compound. Other times you will have sort of and it will turn it into a smaller noun compound with then, you know, adjectival um, modification. So It is a complicated thing. I mean, I would say command center general, you could definitely keep as a full compound in Hebrew. Um, so anyway, my point is that when you see the German after Chelan or Celan, for him as a native German speaker, it was a very intuitive choice to use even neologistic compounding in his poetry in his search after a signature poetic language. It would be probably less intuitive for an author writing in Spanish or Portuguese that they would they probably, I would posit, more prone to circumlocution, meaning that rather than the tersest way of saying something, it kind of waxes lyrical and becomes like a longer form explanation of the same thing. Um, and then Hebrew is very different than these Indo-European tongues. Hebrew is a Semitic tongue, so it's been influenced by many other languages outside of the Semitic family, but ultimately it has a Semitic grammar and vocabulary for the most part. So it's it is hard to say. The structure is so different than German, but I would say that nonetheless, uh, Chelan or Celan's Germanic compounding, which was so intuitive to him as a German speaker, nonetheless made its way into my work in Hebrew and certainly in English as well, and other languages that I've written in. I would say, it's pretty doable actually in Hebrew. Um, Part of it has to do with the so-called non-concatenative morphology of Hebrew, which I'll get into another time. That helps in coining certain neologisms where you don't even have to resort to compounding. Um, and where you do use compounding, you have something in Hebrew which is ready made for that, which is called the construct case, which is common to basically all Semitic languages, including Maltese and Arabic. So it's different though than compounding in German. In German, you would say command center, but in Hebrew and other Semitic languages, it would be something more. If you were going to do it in the so-called construct case, it would be basically center, and then there would be a marking command. So basically center command, but it means command center. So basically the head is switched. Um, but there is a marker at the end of the first word that marks that it's in the construct case. Sometimes the marker is what's called null, so there's no actual change technically, but the change is there. Um, like it's not there. It's not visibly there. It's complete. Basically, what it means is that in some cases, the construct form will be identical to the so-called absolute form. That's what I'm trying to say. But in other cases, the construct form will be distinct from the absolute form. And this may not be very clear what I'm talking about, but I'll explain more about this later. But anyway, my point is that I was heavily influenced by this, but this is shorter form poetry. And then you have Greenberg. He's another um, Hebrew poet who wrote very long poems. Again, long poems about this thickness. Now, there are actual epics, historical epics that were written in Hebrew or Yiddish in the Middle Ages. I mean, I don't know if they're epics exactly, but they were kind of meant as epics. So they exist, what are much more plausibly called epics. And then you have but I would say this is sort of an issue of our own day where probably most would-be epics today qualify in the end as long poems only, structurally speaking. They may take something from epic poems in the more traditional sense, but ultimately would be considered long poems. Why is this interesting? I don't know, but I think that defining for yourself can sometimes help you as a writer and as a reader to sort of categorize for yourself what you're reading. And it also helps to describe it to other people because otherwise it's like, hey, what are you reading these days? Oh, I don't know. It's like this weird book. But if you already know, well, it's actually a long poem. What do you mean? It's like a poem that's long? No, no, long poem is actually a technical term. It means like this really long book length poem. Not always book length, sometimes novella length or short story length, but there's it sort of depends on who defines it, but it's generally speaking not, a page length poem or even 5 or 6 pages. It's usually at least a short story length, at least, and then it extends all the way down to possibly thousands of pages. I mean, if you take the book if not if, I'm sorry, I believe, by oh, I always forget his name. Zelensky? No, something like that. I'm probably I'm totally messing it up, I'm sure. But a Jewish American writer, he wrote I'm sure some of you know who I'm talking about. I apologize uh for this mismemory, but that I would say, this is a very, very long book, but I would say it's ultimately a long poem. Some people, then you have things like The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. I mean, that's like the big whopper, not in terms of length, but in terms of reputation. Uh, I always wonder about T.S. Eliot. I'm not one of these people who boycotts authors or artists based on politics or ideology. But of course, many understand if you're Jewish, you understand that T.S. Eliot had his issues with the Jews. Um, it was a complicated thing, but he definitely. I mean, this is what you would expect also from the era. Uh, I don't know how different things are today, but in any case, I'm not going to, I'm just trying to say that, sometimes you run into things that this is what I'm trying to say ultimately. Like if you want to read my book, you say, well, I'm opposed because I have ideological differences with this guy, which I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here. That's fine, but still deign to read me because I would read you. That's the very thing. Even if you were completely at odds with my political viewpoint, with my ideological viewpoint, I would still want you to read me. And even if I'm completely at odds with your political or ideological viewpoint, I feel I am obliged, if I'm going to read anybody, to read you. I mean, your books. So this is an important thing. I mean, it's also, this extends to music. Are you going to cancel he whose music you disagree, or he whose music uh, concerning whose composer or performer you disagree with said person's politics? This was the worst constructed sentence of all time, but you you hopefully get my drift. So this is the influence, I think, of Hebrew in this case, but that's fine. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, I'm telling you, if you're not sure, just do it. Just read even the books of people you disagree with. Actually, you should read the books of people you disagree with. That's kind of the point. But also read, people that you do agree with, or you're more likely to agree with. And many times you won't know with whom you even agree until you read their book. But ultimately, you should read your enemies. Um, it's hard. It is not easy, especially, you know, if you're reading some, I guess what I'm saying is like, what is the people might ask, what is the good of a Jew reading Mein Kampf? You know, obviously it makes a person's skin crawl. Um, well, many people, certainly most Jews would feel that way and would be shocked that you should even suggest reading such a book. But I believe that you should know your enemies, you should know history. That's just kind of the way it is. I mean, there's no way around it if you really want to be a reader in the widest sense of the term. Because it's not just about reading, it's about reading. And so, you remember that movie, Avatar. I always remember this very simple phrase. It's something that is very indigenous. That is to say that you have what is otherwise a seemingly very simple idiom, not even idiom, but just phrase or sentence, but has a very deep cultural meaning. So what did they say? Something to my memory, I haven't seen it in a long time, but it's something like, I see you. What is, I mean, in a literal sense, it's like, okay, my eyes register you visually, but the meaning is something, I mean, it has a much deeper meaning. I don't even exactly remember what it means, but it's like, I see you. It's like, I acknowledge you. I love you. I feel you. We are one we are on the level. We are together in this. Our existences are joined. There's a number of possible interpretations. I see you. I see you. And so that's really the very thing. That's really the very thing. And you have to be that way even with your enemies, even when you disagree with them, even when you're completely and utterly opposed with the things that they have written. I see you. I see you. So I just wanted to impart that if I could. I don't know if it's of use to you, but I believe it should be. I believe it should be. So I wanted to bring some of these things to your attention today because there are things that are on my mind as a writer, as a reader, as somebody going through war, as someone, thinking a lot about the history that is behind all of these developments in our latter day. And I've been steeped in it. I'm just completely steeped in it. I'm also reading Aniara, which is like this Swedish, I believe, yeah, Swedish, right? No, I always mix it up. Is it Swedish or Norwegian? No, it's Swedish. Oh, it's Swedish, yeah. Anyway, so this is Aniara, and it's essentially this. So here's another case. Basically, I would say probably a long poem, but it's sort of a novel. So maybe it's a novel in verse, but not an epic exactly in the traditional. Not even exactly. It's just not really an epic. But again, it gets to be kind of nebulous. Whether a modern long poem has anything of an epic traditionally or nothing of it at all. It's something you could argue. But anyway, this is essentially a novel in verse, but it's a sci-fi novel, I think from the 50s. And I guess it won the Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken. Big surprise, a Swede wins the Nobel Prize. But I will also say that I have serious problems with the Nobel Prize and other literary awards in general, which we'll get to another time. It's kind of a scam. And I'm not just saying that as a writer, I'm saying that as a as a human being, and I'll explain my reasoning at a certain point. I mean, I think you should read books regardless of how they have been rated by various award um, giving bodies. And there seems to be a strange way, there's a bizarre pattern actually to what kinds of books tend to get awards as opposed to ones that often don't. And then there's a certain class of books that almost never gets the awards, and yet they're probably they all have this shared aspect which mark them as classics. And there are some classics that actually become award winners. That does happen, but they're probably the exception, and the majority of the books per year that win awards are not. And it's not merely because they just don't get picked up and like they're secret classics that nobody reads. No, they many of them really are just not. They don't have that classicity. It's hard, it's difficult to say. A lot of this is so subjective, but there does some seem to be something that distinguishes these different pieces of art.